Well, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the Providing Healthcare in a Pandemic webinar series. We're so glad you're here today. I'm Lisa Green, and I am the program coordinator for the Western New York Rural Area Health Education Center, or R-AHEC for short. We're based in Warsaw in Wyoming County. So just a few things to note. All attendees are muted and we can't see you and we can't hear you, but the chat box is open. Please introduce yourselves there if you'd like to. If you have any questions during the presentation, please break in and ask those in the chat box, and we will ask Samantha and Susan some questions as they go along. When you do, write in the chat box, make sure that you're selecting to send the chat to everyone and not just the panelists so that everybody can see your questions or your comments. Also, you're free to leave the webinar at any time. We're all busy these days. We know if you have to leave early, that is not a problem, but you will be able to access recordings of all of the sessions on our website at ruralahec.org within a day or so of the live sessions. If you have any follow-up questions or you'd like to connect with one of us at a later time, my email is lgreen@r-ahec.org. This webinar series was developed to support our healthcare and service providers. And as you know, we've all faced multiple challenges over the last several months due to the COVID-19 pandemic. So today's session is titled Trauma-Informed Responses to the Dual Pandemics, and our presenters will be discussing what trauma is, some ways it develops, our perception of people with trauma in their background, and how it informs our care of them, and different ways to respond to people in light of their past experiences. So now let's meet our presenters. Samantha Koury is the project manager at the Institute on Trauma and Trauma-Informed Care. Samantha is passionate about increasing awareness of trauma and re-traumatization and working together with organizations and systems to create and sustain trauma-informed culture change. She has 5 years of experience training and coaching staff on trauma and trauma-informed care in a variety of service sectors, including addiction, mental health, medical, education, criminal justice, refugees, and HIV and AIDS. Samantha has also been a co-author on several publications related to trauma-informed care, as well as a co-author of Trauma-Informed Organizational Change Manual for the Trauma and Trauma-Informed Care, which is ITTIC, ITTIC. Let's meet Susan Green. She's a clinical professor at the University of Buffalo School of Social Work. Susan is committed to integration of theory with practice as she combines full-time teaching with clinical practice with individuals, families, and organizations. She's also the co-director of the Institute on Trauma and Trauma-Informed Care, or again, ITTIC. Susan has extensive experience training, consulting, and coaching in various systems around trauma and trauma-informed approaches. She's been a co-author on several publications related to trauma and trauma-informed care, as well as the co-author of ITTIC's recent Trauma-Informed Organizational Change Manual as well. Susan is also certified in the following: eye movement desensitization and reprocessing, or EMDR, advanced critical incident stress management, trauma-focused cognitive behavioral therapy, which is TF-CBT, and cognitive processing therapy, or CPT. So I hope I got all of that right, but I will turn over the presentation to Samantha Koury. Welcome.
Well, actually, I'm going to step in here. This is Sue Green, and thank you so much, Lisa, for the generous introduction. And for any of you that are able to be live with us right now, please, as Lisa said, we absolutely encourage you to reach out to us in the chat. We prefer to be in some level of dialogue. We don't assume that in any way that we know what would be your best hope in terms of what you hope to gain over this next hour and a half that we're together. Sam and I did put together some thoughts. We've had really the honor of being able to be witness with many folks working in many of the roles that some of you are possibly in over these last months, and certainly before the dual pandemic time. And with that being said, I just really think that we're all moving through this as best we can. And so we hope that part of what we talk about will legitimize the pieces that you already know work and matter in regards to staying in a spot that you can, at the end of the day, feel as if you've been useful enough in your role as a helper and or certainly even just a person on the planet these days. And so we have a couple spots that we invite dialogue, but at any point, please feel free to have us be interrupted on some level. And with that being said, Lisa, if you do notice that we've not noticed something in the chat bar, please feel free to interject at any point.
Will do.
Okay, great. It just as a claimer to put out there, anytime that any of us are in a spot of intentionally talking about trauma and or adversity, know that it's very possible, if not probable, that it can create a sense of pause for any one of us. Because what we've learned is that, especially these days, most of us have experienced some type of adversity, if not trauma, in our life. And Sam and I are hoping to position all of us right now in terms of taking notice that when this is in front of us, as it is, it really does matter how it is that we interpret. And so, if you need to step away, take a break, put anything out there with us, please do so. So with that being said, Sam, I will move forward and I'll let you say hello when we get to your slides, if that's okay. When we have described and done what we call a trauma 101 with folks in regards to, what is this thing that we're calling trauma or post-traumatic stress disorder and or adversity. We always start with asking each of us to take an intentional look at noticing when it was that we began doing the work, if you will. There was a point in time that I actually was in my early 20s and I started out as a special educator. And, I had my own worldview and self-view at that point. So if you look at this slide, you see up in the upper left, this small world that speaks to old self and worldview. And what we know is that, again, each of us enters the workforce with our own filter, our own lens, our own perception. And based on the work, we are impacted, right? We can be impacted at a level that sometimes, some of you have heard of the phrases, I'm sure, of getting secondary traumatic stress, if not even feeling if not being compassionately fatigued, vicariously traumatized, let alone also noticing resilience and or growth in other individuals. And so that's what happens. We do our work, we go about it. And I know for me, again, as I look at the decades of, the spots that I've been in, I've been impacted. Things have shifted within me in regards to how it is that I think about myself, let alone the rest of the world. And here we are in 2020. And, March of 2020, if not before, right? We are all experiencing COVID. We're experiencing what we have heard as a pandemic. And at the same time, knowing that it's being referred to now in terms of where you and I sit today, we are in the midst of what's called the dual pandemics. And what we know about that is that if you look at the center part of the slide, you'll see that there's that world, right? And there's a fracture that goes down the center of that world. And we know that each one of us has experienced some aspect of loss. And that's true of our coworkers. That's true of our loved ones. That's true of community, obviously of the world. And you see that header, it says current self and worldview. And it behooves us to be able to name what it is that might be happening. And let alone, each of you are in this spot, right? That you are attending to other. In your role, you might be the lead of the organization, the CEO, or the CME in terms of chief medical officer, or CMO, I should say. And with that being said, you have a workforce. We each have our own families possibly too. And so there is this level of that we possibly have lost individuals to death. We have lost what was seemingly our routine, what we consider to be whatever some will say, when will we return to normalcy, predictability, a level of what's safety. And so that being the common denominator, it matters in the sense of how it is that we interpret the here and now. And we pose to each of us, and we'll weave this throughout the rest of this time with you, that we really believe that how it is that we are today impacts our own future self and our own future worldview. And so what we know is that in the daily interactions and in our work, we talk about those daily interactions being informed from what we call trauma-informed responses, a new what's considered universal precaution, which we'll talk about a bit more, that when we are intentional around noticing what is in front of us, because we've learned that language really is our tool. How we communicate verbally, non-verbally, written, we are 100% responsible for what it is that we say and do. So that's maybe really the good news, that we can take notice of what it is that we're thinking about, what it is that we're feeling about. And this part here that you see that says meaning making, we know that there's a field called post-traumatic growth, that post-trauma, we've learned that individuals actually can grow. And the categories that are affiliated with PTG, as it's referred to, have to do with relating to others, noticing new possibilities, looking at and tapping into personal strength. People describe that post-events, post-trauma, they actually have seen different and increased appreciation of their own life or others, let alone a piece around big picture of spiritual change or whatever that might be for us. And so we believe that when we anchor ourselves in terms of, yeah, right now, there's a fracture. The dual pandemics refers to specifically COVID and civil unrest, the isms, which we'll talk about in a bit. And so the next slide, Sam, we know that when we think about this term called trauma, 1980 is when post-traumatic stress disorder got on the books in terms of it being a legitimate diagnosis. So again, I can't see you, so I can't make an assumption about age, but you can see me. You know, literally I was 19 in 1980. And so when you think about world and self-view, we've learned that probably by around the age of 10 is when individuals have a good sense of self and other. For those of you that are parents or you have, you're with children, True, brain develops into one's 20s. But what we've learned is that individuals that grow up with adverse experiences, let alone even trauma experiences in their childhood, that will inform their lens, their filter. And we've known that post-traumatic stress disorder, the good news is that people that are diagnosed with PTSD, when we look at the general population of stats, if you will, less than 10% of individuals that go through a traumatic event actually end up with full-blown PTSD. Others, though, and it makes me think about, and you being in healthcare, certainly you would know this better than I, but I often think about somebody who's diagnosed with diabetes, type 2, adult onset, and or pre-diabetic, right? We know that there's this, then I'm making this signal here of kind of this line, as if I was standing in front of you. If I was standing on this side of the line, I would say to you, hey, when somebody is informed that they are pre-diabetic, there's red flags, right? There's symptoms, there's things that risk factors and or evidence that something's up with them. And there are many times folks in your profession will say, if you do this or this lifestyle change, etc., it's possible, if not probable, that you may not even need to go to that other side of the line and be diagnosed with full-blown diabetes. What we've learned about trauma is that often individuals will move through a trauma experience, and it's like as if you had a bone break ever in your life. I know for me, I did, and I'm holding onto my hand because that's where it was. Later in years, that's the spot on my hand that's the sore spot when it's cold and damp out there. Meaning that the scar and or even though it's still very functional, the body memory is there. What we've learned about trauma is that the body keeps the score. If you have any interest in terms of learning more about the epigenetic component, in terms of even the physiological piece, the neural network of trauma, highly recommend that you take a look at, there's a text called The Body Keeps the Score, Bessel van der Kolk. And what we do know, just to go back to PTSD for a moment, there are certain types of trauma that there's a higher rate percentage of individuals that get full-blown, right? You could be pre-diabetic, full-blown diabetes over here. Pre-PTSD, meaning traumatic symptoms, full-blown PTSD. That individuals that the redeployments, severe sexual assault, severe physical assault, about a third of individuals end up with full-blown PTSD. Next slide, Sam. And so what we've learned is that truly, and SAMHSA puts this out in regards to letting us know that for each of us, trauma is a very individualized experience. You and I could be in that same house fire and or car accident and or witness the shooting, and the after effects look different possibly for each of us, how we interpreted if we were 3 years old, 13 years old, 53 years old. All of that comes into play. But again, similar to the bone break, as I said to you, and what we know about memory, right? Bottom line is that any event that goes on, when we've learned about the brain, we process every event through our cognitions, through our affect in terms of emotional response and body response. So they call that the cognitive triangle. Every event that occurs. So when the fumble occurred, if you're a Bills fan, the fumble occurred on that last play, or one of the last plays, the third to last play this last Sunday, and we beat the New England Patriots. Sorry, maybe this shouldn't be on tape, but I'm putting it there. For me as a Bills fan, woohoo! My thought was, holy, yay, right? My body responded with tense, increased, everything's running. And I was elated. If you were a Patriots fan, same event, maybe your same cognitive response was the same, but you were agitated or angry in terms of the loss. And not to make light of trauma, but my point is that no matter what the event is, know that there is an individualized experience of it. Next slide, Sam. And so what we've learned, and if you're not familiar with something called the Adverse Childhood Experience Study, if there's any take home from this webinar, we ask that you allow yourself to take note of this study. It was done originally in the 90s. Doctors Anda and Folletti, who are non-behavioral health docs, they did a study, 17,000 plus individuals who were actually in the workforce. They were under the Kaiser Permanente health plan, men and women in terms of gender identification. And long story short, the individuals were in what was called an obesity study. Folletti and Anda were curious as to what it was that individuals would lose weight and they would stop doing what worked. They dropped out. And so they collected the narratives. I'm making a very long story simplified here. They collected the narratives of these individuals. And what they found out, if you look on the ground level, and if you look at the upper level of this, and the upper level of the tree, in terms of what's in the sky, those are the original findings that Folletti and Anda found out that individuals that experience adverse child events, meaning that by the time of birth to 18, if they grew up in a home that there was domestic violence, or they grew up in a home that there was divorce, physical or emotional neglect, you can see the slide here, that any one of those things, they would score an ACE score of 1. If there were more yeses, they would have an ACE score of 3, 4, 6, 7. And beneath the soil, you can see that this is the advanced, if you will, version of the understanding that we as a world have identified, that individuals that also grow up communities where there's violence, discrimination, poverty, poor housing quality, poor affordability options, lack of opportunity, that those experiences are also considered to be adverse. And so what we know about trauma and adversity is, and I ask you to notice this in the languaging, adversity doesn't necessarily equal trauma. However, adverse events can be experienced as being traumatic. And when something is traumatic to someone, and I talked about the cognitive triangle, and Sam's going to talk about this in a moment, the part of the brain that holds on to the emotional valence of the event of memory stays put. It stays within the body, keeps the score. And so post 9/11, for example, individuals that were witness to the 9/11, that were there at the towers and saw, individuals that had previous adverse, if not trauma history, were at higher risk at that event in time to get then and tip over to full-blown PTSD. Those were the numbers. Similarly, when looking at military and looking at redeployments, etc., individuals that have high ACE scores often are the individuals that we're seeing are at risk, if you will, for the full-blown PTSD. That's a lot to digest, but hopefully a good setting in terms of, Sam, I'll ask you to talk about the pandemics at this point.
Sure. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for letting us be with you this afternoon. And so for us, Sue had mentioned the importance of being able to name, what is happening for ourselves and those around us specifically, especially you being in the workforce, for those that you are attending to, working with. And so an important way, we think, to be able to do that is to be able to describe, think about, understand how it is that trauma, adversity, certainly extreme stress, crisis can impact the brain. And so there are two visuals that I'm going to ask you to think about here, and I'll talk about both of them in a moment in terms of how we understand the survival or the stress response, and what that means not only for folks who have histories of trauma and adversity, as Sue was just describing, and also thinking about the context of being in these dual pandemics right now. And so Dr. Dan Siegel has developed what he calls the hand model of the brain. And so hopefully everybody is able to see me. It certainly is on the slide after this, if you want to revisit it. And he also has a quick YouTube link if you just type in Dan Siegel, hand model of the brain. But the way that it works, if you hold your hand out like this, that this represents your brain, right? Very simplistically speaking, by folding your thumb over the palm of your hand, that is meant to represent your amygdala, right? And so that is the emotional part of our brain. It gets first dibs on sensory information. It is really concerned about your survival, right? And so you might have heard of the fight, flight, or freeze response before that I'm going to talk about more in just a moment, right? This part of the brain is what sends the alarm, so to speak, to get your body ready to deal with stress, threat, etc. And so what we know is that especially when individuals experience what we call complex trauma, right? And so trauma over an extended period of time, often from a young age, multiple traumatic events, that this part of the brain can actually be larger in physical size compared to those who have not, and tends to be overactive, okay? By folding your thumbs over, your fingers over your thumb, that represents your cortex, specifically prefrontal cortex, right? And so we know that's what separates us from animals. It is responsible for our higher order thinking, executive functioning, impulse control, being able to think ahead about a decision before we make an action around it. It's critical for learning, right? So all of those good things that we all need as individuals functioning on the planet, right? And so again, thinking about those with histories of trauma, that this part of the brain can actually be smaller in physical size, but tends to be underactive, okay? And so typically what happens in terms of the survival response, I'm going to use this as a way of describing that. And so when you think about an example such as if you're walking in a forest and you see a bear, right? So clearly the bear is a threat, right? And what happens is that the amygdala, so this part of the brain, sends the alarm. So it starts firing and firing until the lid flips. So if you've heard the expression, someone's flipped their lid before, right? This is the image I'm going to ask you to keep in your mind, right? Because your body needs to get ready to either fight the bear, maybe not advisable, but might happen, right? To run from the bear, or sometimes people freeze, right? When they are overwhelmed by a threat, real or perceived, freeze is also a third response that we know is the survival response. Those three pieces, and that's individualized for different people, right, is how people have learned how to survive. And this happens instantaneously, right? And so if you think about that quickly, right, this part of our brain that does all of that higher order thinking, it makes sense that this kind of goes offline, right? Because if you think about another scenario, if you're walking across the street and all of a sudden a car comes whipping around the corner, it's not like you're like, maybe I should get out of the way, right? You just move, right? And so that's the survival piece, right? And so, in the bear scenario or the car scenario, eventually you get back to a safe spot and the lid comes back down and you return to your baseline level of functioning, right? This is a survival adaptive response. However, what we do know is that this response tends to be overactive for folks who have histories of trauma, but specifically thinking about the current reality, right? That we are in the middle of these dual pandemics, right? We have not been able to put the period at the end of the sentence, so to speak. We don't know when it's going to be over, how, what that's going to look like. We're still in the middle of it, right? And so I'd invite you to think about the dual pandemics as the bear, right? The bear is all around us still, right? The threat of COVID, the threat of the civil unrest, et cetera, that's been happening certainly over the last 8 to 9 months plus is still very much around. And so what we're really finding, and I'm sure that you also know this just as well as we can describe, if not better, is that people are functioning out of this flip lid state. And that could be ourselves, that could be the individuals you work with, it could be your friends and loved ones, it could be your boss, your workforce, right? In terms of people are activated, right? Because we know that this amygdala, right, the thumb part of the hand model of the brain is on overdrive, right? It's constantly sending the alarm because we are waiting for that next bad thing to happen, right? When we don't know what is coming down the pike, so to speak, especially for folks who have histories previous to these pandemics of trauma and adversity, that activation is happening. And so we are absolutely still, as of November 3rd, still experiencing, for many of us, this heightened feelings of worry, fear, anxiety, and stress. And that's just it is, right, in terms of being able to label, name, some of what might be happening for any of us on the planet these days.
And Sam, if we could maybe both talk for a couple of moments. We have spoken with lots of spots and healthcare centers specifically. If you're situated in New York State and watching this, our experience of COVID is different than other parts of the world or country based on the timing of when COVID occurred. And occurred. I said that in past tense when we were first in with the initial hit in terms of the United States. And so what we've heard from healthcare professionals is that the act mode in terms of do and being able to pretty much keep full brain for a lot of it in terms of executive do mode was pretty intensely possible between, let's say, that end of February, March, up until the end of the summer. And as people, and not to say this is all spots at all, as people began to then get a sense of maybe a little bit of a pause and not have to be in the act crisis mode, is when people began to experience the other pieces of noticing sadness, noticing agitation, noticing worry, etc. And yet, as Sam just described, the bear is still here within the dual pandemics. And even folks that don't have the histories, as we often have seen in the past, of adversity or trauma, even if that's not there, this ongoing piece of not in any way believing to know what's next can create distress, obviously, for all of us. And so they're seeing it played out in the workforce in a way that people are in a pretty protective, myopic stance and not as giving and as connected as they were maybe even during the crisis time. Sam, do you have thoughts on that based on what we've heard and what you're noticing in spots?
Sure. Yeah, I think that it's critical for any of us to even think about what's different between when this started and what now. And I would echo everything that you have said just based on the different spots that we're in. And I think the other piece that I would add is, not that people weren't tired initially, but I think that, specifically you mentioned the end of the summer, right? Is that there's this fatigue wall, if you will, is kind of, I think, what it was put out in the paper articles that I have read. And people are exhausted, right? And, certainly that's a function of it's been a long time, but, even going back to this brain science that we just talked about, right? This survival response is designed to get you in and get out, basically, right? And so when it's activated over and over and over again, and there's no end in sight, right? It makes a lot of sense that people are physically, not only emotionally, but physically exhausted based on what is happening. So I think that the increase in fatigue, again, not that it wasn't there up front, is another piece of what we've been seeing and hearing, is just people don't have it in the same way, possibly. And of course, everybody's experience is different.
Lisa, thank you for putting something out on the chat. And Sam, Lisa's saying to all of us, a term that she is hearing is depression. And that's not something that we've directly stated. So I know for me, clinically, I often avoid going there in terms of using that word because depression is a whole different diagnosis than PTSD is. However, depression is often how a lot of us talk about now. I've heard many people describe that piece of having anticipatory grief let alone here and now grief and previous grief. So when there's an ongoingness of perceived and real loss, that can create a sense of not feeling very hopeful, a sense of distress in terms of one of the things that we might talk more about later is a term that folks specifically in the healthcare world are experiencing, and that's called moral distress. And moral distress is specific to the fact that sometimes we're not able to do what it is either value-based wise or ethically we believe is the best right practice or thing to do. And some of the decisions that folks have described that they're in, and even we'll say, you know, it's not the same in terms of, but it's similar feeling state of, you know, your kids aren't in school, or all of these changes in terms of what's the best, not great option that we can make here, knowing it doesn't fit best practice or what we know has in the past been the best thing. And again, if you're an individual that in any way tends to be, and you know, I learned back in the day that depression and anxiety are almost on the same continuum. And so for some, it might look more like anxiety or feel that way. And others, it might look more like sadness and depression and that, and or there's some of us that might experience all parts of that continuum. And some of us are more prone or susceptible to pieces of, depending on who we are, genetics, et cetera, what's worked before or not. That bottom line is that there's been an increase that we're seeing in terms of folks using substance, coping skills maybe not being at the level of what, quote, any of us might know as best practice, and that's being played out throughout the workforce. And so only you and I know for ourselves, what does that look like? Am I feeding myself what is best in terms of keeping myself in a way that I know that I'll be as ready for the day? And bottom line is, we're also moving into the dark time. Hello, you know, it's fall. We just lost an hour of sleep, you know, like it's dark. And so we've heard of seasonal depression before, right? And so it's all there in many ways. Sam, anything to add to that? And I know that you have the next slide too. So certainly I moved in on that.
Yeah, for sure. No, I think, again, just echoing, and I just see a couple other comments in the chat box in terms of also really hearing tired or worn out frequently. Someone shared, I live in New York State. My family in other states are at different times of the outbreaks. They're going through the same process that you were describing, Sue, but at different times. And Lisa, just reiterating that what you described accurately is depicting the conversation. So yeah, all of that, absolutely. And I think that this next slide here will, you know, hopefully help give a couple more examples of what people's experiences have been, you know, thinking about the last 8-9 months. And so, you know, at the Trauma Institute, we are, you know, I personally feel honored to be part of witnessing and being with folks in lots of different systems, from certainly healthcare, hospitals, to schools, to nonprofit agencies and beyond. And so we've, you know, been in there with them in terms of really talking about and being able to hear what people have been experiencing. And so this slide, I'm going to pull up, you know, a word or two at a time in terms of just what we've been hearing. Certainly this is not an exhaustive list by any means. However, we thought it might be useful to, again, in the being able to name some of what people are experiencing, and we've made comment to some of these already, but I just ask you to listen and think about really what your own experience has been. So we have insufficient or no PPE, not having enough resources, fear of their own exposure to COVID-19, and therefore fear of exposing family members to COVID-19, you know, especially in healthcare, that has been a piece that right from the beginning. Working long hours, a perceived or real lack of communication. As Sue had mentioned before, the notion of moral injury or moral distress, vicarious trauma, compassion fatigue, those blurring of roles or wearing multiple hats in ways that they didn't before. Certainly illness and death, having high caseloads or a surge in patients, not having the option not to work, an increased risk of both getting sick in terms of COVID and being mistreated based on being a person of color, overdose, certainly isolation, especially again, moving towards holiday time. Something called decision fatigue, which we might talk a little bit more later, but basically when you have to make rapid decisions over a short period of time, especially under stress, that our capacity or the quality of those decisions decreases, it becomes a lot more challenging. Also noticing certainly leadership support in terms of appreciating, folks that are making decisions or trying to do the best they can in terms of checking in with the workforce and seeing what is needed to continue forward. Absolutely have heard from multiple systems this increased collaboration in terms of with their colleagues, but certainly across systems to just get it done in terms of what it is that we need to do to respond. I think probably the biggest protective factor in my mind that I've heard from folks is just, being with colleagues and having the support from people who are doing the work, the same work that you're doing, checking in with each other, picking up where the other one left off, et cetera. Again, that collaboration and the community support. So, this is a lot, right? And this is not even an exhaustive list. And there are so many moving pieces that, hopefully this punctuates a little bit of what we had talked about in terms of the reality of right now. And, I just want to reiterate the piece of what Sue said, is that what we experienced in terms of feelings, thoughts, the body experience back in March may look different than it does now. And it may look different it does now than it did for you this morning, right? And so that there is this, trauma-informed care, as we'll talk about, absolutely starts with self anyway. But this piece around noticing and being able to name what is the experience, whether it's your own micro experience, what's happening in general in the world earlier today versus 6 months ago, et cetera. I just think that that's been a very important piece in terms of people being able to continue forward. Anything you want to add to that, Sue?
No, I think it does bring us into really this next slide of, again, we invite you, please, if you would, to utilize the chat box here. We titled this The Reality of Now. And we ask you to think about, what are your thoughts about COVID and its impact? How do you think about it? How do your loved ones think about it? How does your boss and or your workforce or team members think about it? How does your community think about it? Because certainly we know that there's varied ways that people are approaching and or thinking about and when it comes to COVID and its impact. I'd ask you to think about, when we're thinking about the dual pandemic piece, what are your thoughts about racism? And is that a term, is that a thing that you have allowed yourself to be intentional in regards to noticing? Do you believe that it's true? Do you know that it's true? Is it part of your experience? What's it like in the spot that you work, the community, the organization, in the state? Systematic, institutional. When we think about trauma and we think about a term called historical trauma, knowing that there are groups of people through the decades that experienced a similar event at one point in time, that still carry that event based on the science of what we know in terms of epigenetics. And the key thing about, for us, this webinar or our work is that when we learn, and I've done the work for a while and didn't know the terms, but we've learned that things like policies or procedures or tones or the way that we do business often can hurt people unintentionally, which we'll talk about, but always in a way that when people have experienced any of these pieces, let alone we've got the bear in front of us right now, people are probably, including self, I'm more apt to be a bit more hypersensitive or a bit more possibly overcritical. And so also when you think about your thoughts, I'm asking you to notice, what are your cognitions? What's the interplay of the dual pandemics in your workforce? We're each in this position of witnessing. And depending on your role, right? I'm in front of virtually, I'm in front of people, right? As a teacher, as a trainer, as a boss. And I know that that carries something different than when I am in my role as daughter or friend or partner or community member. And depending on how I react influences, right? Has impact on the people around me, let alone then myself. And what do I know about this stuff? Do I have knowledge? Do I even have a sense of what it might be being experienced by with others? And so that's that piece here on this slide that we ask you to, how is it that you're noticing your own story, your own narrative? What's the deal around equity? What's your knowledge base around the groups of individuals you interact and interface with in terms of history, intergenerational, and your own knowledge base? And maybe it's maybe this is new news, right? That this new approach, newer, last decade plus, of being trauma informed in our responses. And that's the piece that we talked about, and you would know better, certainly, and I being in healthcare, you put gloves on, right? Universal precaution in the sense of body fluid or whatever. You don't go up to somebody, there's body, and say, oh, are you HIV positive? Are you that? You protect, and you just do what you got to do. It's just universal. In a similar way, that's what the call is now in regards to asking us to, when we do trauma-informed medicine, when we do what's called trauma-informed educational practice, when we do something called trauma-informed care, it means that we are using a lens, a view of universal precaution. Thank you so much for some of the stuff that's coming up in the chat here. I see that you are experiencing the here and now, the reality of now, of challenging, exhausting, isolating. The reality of now is a much more positive term than the new normal. No one wants to believe that this is our new normal. Thanks, Lisa. Yeah, the reality of now. It's a very scary situation. I think it will change the way we interact and how we live our lives. I already see that I'm adapting certain behaviors to protect myself. Thank you for that honesty. And, Sam, I'll ask you to go to this next slide. That when we are in that spot of noticing the current reality, again, going back to that very first slide, you and I are in spots, no matter what our position is in life, to at least be willing to know that re-traumatization is likely happening. And that's where this all starts. Are you willing to believe, or do you already know that? You know, like at my work over the decades, again, 1980, people, you know, Freud is the first one that talked about trauma back in the late 1800s. It's not an easy thing to, you know, sit with. It hurts. It's painful. And here's the deal when it comes to trauma. We've heard from survivor after survivor, types of trauma after types of trauma. The first most important thing that matters to a person who has moved through a trauma event is that they are believed, witnessed, and seen. Believed, witnessed, and seen. Secondarily would be things like litigation, etc. Judith Herman, she wrote a book called Trauma and Recovery. She literally came to UB about a decade or so ago. I could be losing time here, but many a survivor that she's done work with. And that's the findings of when talking with, quote, groups of people around. Think about Native Americans. You think about a term called post-traumatic slavery syndrome in terms of thinking about Blacks, thinking about Asians in regards to internment camps. That individuals who have gone through a collective experience in terms of historical trauma, we can't fix what's happened. It's done. The past is the past. And that's who you have in front of you in your healthcare world, right? In your 10-minute interaction. People come in with their story. The whole person comes in front of you. It's not your job to have to go back and get the details. But if someone possibly is walking in with a flip lid because they've now gone through and had to retell their story 3 times because of the type of intake process that your system has, or there wasn't a live person answering the phone, and now this is the whatever time that they're trying to get a hold of somebody, so they're agitated, they feel powerless. Or the type of physical exam or something, you know, they're used to somebody not telling them up front first what they can expect is going to happen. I mean, you got to do your job, as do I with certain things, right? And what we know, though, is if you believe that now the pandemics, let alone whatever else might be happening in the workplace and or your style, can create, next slide, please, Sam, pieces of re-traumatization. And that's heavy. You know, when I learned about this, you know, I'd been a social worker, a direct care worker, special educator, as I said. And sometimes the way I was trained to do my work actually ended up being more hurtful than helpful. And I didn't know what I didn't know. And now I know. And that's the plus, that we can be, it doesn't even take money, right? We can start to take a look at noticing these next pieces that we'll talk about in terms of values, then principles, the anchoring components of what it means to be trauma informed. That when we look at things that are typical procedures and policies, the way things are done, it might be more hurtful than helpful. Is there maybe a different way we could do this? And so I ask, is it possible that given what's going on, and, you know, I think we've all probably heard the phrase, all we have is today, all we have is this moment. We really can't predict the future. We all kind of known that, right? I don't know that we all, me included, lived all that. I was planning out till, you know, what would be tomorrow, let alone 6 months from now, a year from now, right? The planner. And there's a reality of, yeah, it is what it is. We, you know, like what I have is right now. And so might there be ways, and I see the, you know, I read the comment of ways to protect self for sure. And yet maybe that protection is creating a different type of possibility for us, a different appreciation, a way to connect with self and other differently, a way to really take full responsibility of our language, meaning what I say and what I do and how I say it, it is on me. And so might there be ways to really slow down and take a look at that? Comments, questions, thoughts from folks? Sam, I'll let you read that chat.
Okay. Many of us have also changed roles as a result of the pandemic. I am used to helping the people I serve in my profession, but now my family is looking to me for answers because I am the medical professional in the family. It's a different role for me. I'm used to helping one or two at a time through a physical injury, but this is much, much larger. Also, taking on new clients is difficult because I don't know what their quote unquote normal is. Are they acting this way as a result of the additional stress, or is this a recurrent problem? Very difficult to know and understand.
Whoa, yes. Anybody have thoughts for, I'm going to pronounce maybe Lauren. You know, I think there's a few things that my guess is that most of us would believe that it matters that we treat the whole person. And I believe that often I'm not sure about your work, but in my field, our fields, I think the helping profession, we're often very siloed in regards to, you go over here to get this done, you go there for that, come over here for this. And my brain comes with me even if I have a knee ache. My brain comes with me even if I'm abusing substances. My brain comes with me if I have a gastrointestinal issue. Oh, that's right, meaning the amygdala, the stored piece, the whole picture. And especially when we think about trauma, and I'm not saying it's all about trauma at all, but the beauty of events and the human condition is that we often can keep things, I call it the trauma wall. So if someone's experienced adversity and trauma, it doesn't necessarily have to play out in the here and now. But when it gets reactivated and re-triggered and re-traumatized, and we're on this ongoing, the bear has not left, the pandemics are still here. The trauma response, if you're experiencing any of this pandemic stuff as being traumatic, it means that the bear is still very actively in front of you. So of course we're going to protect. That's automatic. And so there is wear and tear with that. And that might be true of your individual or your family members or whoever else. And, you know, the other piece is that what I'm seeing here in terms of the chat box is that burnout and or too much and or knowing your limits, right? Burnout specifically in terms of terms has to do with resource depletion, meaning system depletion, doing too much with less. And that can happen in retail, that can happen in healthcare, schools, etc. Overload, right? Compassion fatigue, vicarious trauma, secondary traumatic stress are more individualized. But again, you know, I'm sitting here talking with you, at you, but with you, hopefully, in a very different spot than I would have done it a year ago. I didn't have this setup in this room at my house. We're doing things different. We really are. Sam.
I would just add, and you know, it sort of transition us into the next slide in a moment, but I am struck with certainly the comments that have come in recently in terms of, and I hate to simplify it to this piece, but the fact that you're taking pause to take notice and think about what's happened or what's happening here versus what is wrong with these individuals, whether that means your own family or the individuals you're working with in terms of clients, patients, and yeah, and that allows space, I think, in terms of witnessing, acknowledging, validating. So going back to Sue, what you said before, that Judith Herman has taught us that at the end of the day is most important. Certainly understanding, what's going on and those kinds of things is important depending on your role in that. But I think just the simple act of taking pause and taking notice is very much in line with what we know. And then the comments in terms of paying attention to our words and language, it's the way that we respond, even if we can't fix or do anything about what is happening, is really my best hope for the message for you to take away from today. So I appreciate everybody's comments.
Sam, I'm going to read another comment here. Lisa, thank you. The constant unsettled feeling is very wearing. Love the idea that Tamara had about words becoming as healing as hugs, a new way to think about connecting with our loved ones. Our family was unable to say goodbye to my dad, and our mom is not able to be hugged right now. I'm sorry for that too. Wow. Okay, so say goodbye to your dad. Your mom is not able to be hugged right now. Our words matter more than ever. We talk a lot in our organization about stigma, and that is another layer of our communication and connection. I'll put another term that we haven't mentioned yet out here. And I'm not suggesting, Lisa, this is true for you, but there's something called traumatic grief. And it's a term that's used when specifically it was homicide. When there was a homicide victim, it was the family members experiencing the loss of their loved one, and at the same time, it being traumatic. And this is us, meaning Sam and I don't know that I've read it anywhere yet, but we believe that the types of losses, the deaths specifically during COVID and during this time, absolutely might be experienced as traumatic grief for people. And that's for real. There's a grief process anyway in regards to loss and death. Add trauma to that piece and it's complex. And it's real. It's real. Naming it is important. Similarly to someone that I became aware of in terms of losing their loved one, a son, to an overdose in this recent past. There is nothing simple about this, and it is wearing. That's deep, that's heavy. I appreciate, as Sam said, folks putting it out there, though, because again, we can't fix and or change what's already occurred. What we do have influence over, though, is our willingness to take pause and to name what is. And if you're anything like me, my preferred way, you'd never know it by the way I'm talking, but my preferred way is to avoid. I don't want to. I don't like to feel this stuff, to be honest with you. And yet what I do know is that when named and shared and witnessed, it matters. And it has mattered for me in my life. I'll keep noticing the chat box. Sam, if you want to continue, if you have any thoughts to my comments or you want to shift, doesn't matter. Please.
So, I again, just echoing everything that Sue just said and continuing on in terms of what is our response, because we do know it matters how it is that we respond now and what impact that will have not only on self, but those that we are responding to. And there's a lot going on that we don't have control over and that we can't fix, and we can't make better for others as much as us in the helping profession oftentimes want to. And so I personally think that the trauma-informed approach, or trauma-informed care, or trauma-informed medicine, as Sue had mentioned previously, just allows for the opportunity of what, you know, you have all been willing to make comment to, in terms of certainly taking that pause, and being able to be intentional about the way that we respond, you know, given noticing what is happening for folks. And so if you've heard of trauma-informed care before, it's likely that you've heard this phrase in terms of the paradigm shift is what it's called. And that truly at the end of the day, you know, universal precaution, as Sue had described, you know, we are asking ourselves, our organizations, our systems to put on metaphorical gloves, right? So not gloving up in a different way, in terms of being very intentional about, instead of asking what is wrong with somebody, right? It's what has happened. And again, I've made comment that you have all have been demonstrating that line of thinking just based on your chat boxes. And so this is what we know makes a difference. It almost doesn't matter, and I don't want to say it doesn't matter in terms of what the details of what it has happened to somebody, whether we're talking about, you know, previous to the dual pandemics, how it is that they're experiencing some of these pieces. Like, this is universal precaution. We are responding to everybody just based on, we know that people are more likely than not to have a history of adversity, if not trauma, and the added layer of we're all going through these dual pandemics, right? And so it's about the way that we do the work that we do to respond to ensure this universal precaution, which we'll talk a little bit about how to do that. And so there's a couple of different models, if you will, of trauma-informed practices, but we follow Harrison Fallett's model of trauma-informed care. And so they propose what are called the 5 guiding values and principles. And those are what you see on the screen here in terms of safety, which is both physical and emotional safety. And we think about trustworthiness in terms of being clear, being transparent, making sure we're following through on what we say we're going to do, how expectations are put out there, what we know and what we don't know put out there. How do we think about being intentional about choices or options, even if they're small? How is it that we work with people instead of to or for them? And then empowerment, right? In terms of really being a noun and not a verb. This is really about noticing what capacity is already there, and building on that, and really building, especially these days, you know, a realistic sense of hope for the future. And you do have a handout that I'll pull up just to make comment to briefly in a minute. But you'll see here the title of this slide is Neutralizing the Environment, right? And so the key piece that, there's a couple key pieces that I've said, but that I hope you take away from today is that this trauma-informed approach is not about treating trauma or fixing it or, you know, doing anything with the details. This is truly about how is it that we can at least not make it worse. That we are neutralizing the environment, meaning we are doing the best that we can on our side of the street, whether that means as an individual or as an organization or system, to prevent that unintentional lid flipping for certainly those receiving services, but also the workforce. So we're neutralizing that potential to hopefully facilitate, promote an environment that allows for healing and growth. You're not specifically addressing the trauma. We are working to create a space, an environment, being intentional about our interactions, our policies, procedures, the physical space even, or the virtual space, depending on how it is that you're doing things these days, so that it at least doesn't make it worse. And so by anchoring and being intentional, I think a lot of these things tend to happen naturally anyway with folks that are in the helping profession. But being very intentional about these 5 values and principles is what we know at the end of the day makes a difference, and what we believe certainly will change the imprint, if you will, that this experience will have once we are able to put the period at the end of the sentence. Anything you want to add before I pull up the handout? Okay. I'll just swap my screen share over. So if you haven't already, you will have a handout that we've provided, and I'm just pulling it up on my screen here so you can see in terms of how is it that we think about these 5 values and principles. And so I'm looking over here because I have a double screen, so I apologize for not looking directly at the camera. But this is a resource that we wanted to provide for all of you in terms of really operationalizing and thinking about, what is it that these 5 words mean, right? Because they seem simple and they seem, yeah, that makes sense in terms of at face value. However, what this handout really does for anybody looking at it certainly is makes it actionable. And you'll see here that there is a chart under each of these values and principles that asks you to consider how is it that we create safety for individuals. If you're in the position of being in a leadership spot, how is it that you create that value principle for staff, the workforce, as well as thinking about the organization or system as a whole. Because trauma-informed approaches really is a culture shift. It is beyond our micro interactions between each other. Certainly that's important. But it recognizes that if the organization of the system is not trauma-informed with the workforce, that the workforce is not going to be able to be at their best, to be okay, to be well, to be trauma-informed with the individuals that they work with. And so you can see here various different examples, certainly don't need to read them, but how is it that we check in? How do we acknowledge, name, witness what is, right? In terms of thinking about trustworthiness, again, the expectations. The biggest piece that we've heard be useful, I think, is around communication specifically, in terms of let's be transparent about both what we know, but also what we don't know, right? It's better in some ways to hear, we don't know yet, but we'll let you know when we do, versus not hearing anything at all, right? And so thinking about those kinds of pieces, any level of structure, consistency that we can build in, right? There's lots of things that have changed, but even if, clients or the workforce knows that on blah time at this day, this is when there will be updates posted and they know they can access it here, that in and of itself, that consistency and structure allows people to feel like, okay, at least there's something, right, that I can count on, I can rely on. Voice, right? Because there's a lot of things outside of our control. And so how do we model a focus on what we do have some control over? How do we provide folks with options, whether it's, do you want to talk at this time or this time? Do you want to do it this way or this way? Even if there's things that have to be done, we can be very intentional about building in small choices. And sometimes the choice could be, a consequence, right? In terms of this is what needs to happen or this will happen. And then respecting people's right to make that option. Collaboration, I just will make a quick comment in terms of it's more than teamwork. This is truly conveying and believing that whoever else is in front of you is the expert of their own experience, whether that means, a client's experience, whether that means your colleague or your workforce, in terms of how is it that we make decisions together around recognizing that people have their expertise around their experience. How do we get feedback from folks around what is working and what could be different, right? And then the empowerment piece in terms of, we were in a room together, which we're not, I'd ask folks to look around quickly for 5 things that are blue, right? And then once they have them, look up front at me, what yellow things did you see? Right? People oftentimes laugh, right? What do you mean yellow, right? But people are so busy looking for blue, they're not paying attention to the other colors in the room, right? And so it's kind of a silly example, but I think it punctuates this piece that we are very much in a problem-focused society. And I think especially these days, it's really easy to notice what's not working, how we wish things could be back to where they were before, et cetera. And of course, we have to name that, we have to acknowledge those pieces. And empowerment is asking us to also notice what is working, what doesn't need to change, what any level of success, even today, this week, this month, and during this pandemic time has happened, and how do we build on that? So there's lots of pieces here. There's lots of actionable items. They're not even an exhaustive list by any means, but we'd invite you to sit with this a little bit and notice, what are you already doing? And what else maybe you could be a little bit more intentional about. So you have that handout, or you will if you haven't gotten it already. All right, bring it back over here.
What and Sam probably will point this out, but then you'll see in the slides a similar piece here that, again, structure and what we can have control over seems to matter. So the more, for me, when I'm aware of the fact that, okay, how can I ensure trustworthiness here? How might I ensure a level of collaboration? Okay, well, you know what? there needs to be something about safety. How can I create emotional safety right now? Somebody's presenting in front of me, but overload, I can't. Okay, so do I need to give a choice? And so that's the mind shift. That's the piece when Sam's saying to us, what else is yellow or what's yellow? Hello. I mean, it's kind of like, wow, what I notice gets bigger. And, you know, I'm a trauma head. I notice trauma. Yet, am I also noticing what's working? What is helping someone get through that next hour? When has it been better before? Are there any times that it's at least a little bit better? That was just my added piece there, Sam.
Yeah, absolutely. And so, you know, there's, again, lots of words on these slides, and you have these slides, but when you're thinking about responding, you know, I think that we're very quick as the helping profession. Certainly, I don't want to speak for everybody because people are different, to go to how do we, you know, respond to the client? How do we respond to the person that we're here? Because of course, that's why we're here. We want to be helpful. We want to respond to others that we're working with. And yet, as I had said before, you know, we have to come back to self and noticing, you know, again, what many of you put in the chat box in terms of the burnout, the compassion fatigue, et cetera. And I know you have the whole other session on the self-care pieces. However, we couldn't not, you know, acknowledge the fact that, you know, part of being trauma informed is being responsive to yourself, but certainly your colleagues. And again, for those of you that are in a leadership position, how do you think about this for the workforce? Right, and so similar style, if you will, to the chart that I had just pulled up, but really thinking about what is it that I can do for myself? What can I do at a colleague level or peer level? And, you know, thinking about the organization as a whole or the workforce, what are some of the actionable items in terms of what makes a difference? How do we keep going? You know, how do we get from one moment to the next? Because it's been hard. Right, it's there's all the things that I had pulled up on the slide in terms of the experiences shared, right, and many of the experiences that you shared, that these are the kinds of things that we know when we are intentional about it, and we're not gonna put it to the side because we have to put out all these fires and do all these things, that we are intentional about creating time and space for self and for each other, that we're just better positioned to do what we need to do, right? And so, you know, again, the acknowledging, witnessing, you know, asking already folks what has worked, asking yourself what has worked before and what do you need? How is it that we balance this need for, certainly there needs to be flexibility and understanding, while also there needs to be parameters, right? We still got to do work, we still got to respond and show up in the way that we're expected to. And so how do we strike that balance? What does that look like? You know, encouraging routine, focusing on what is expected versus what is not. How do we come?
Sam, I'm going to ask you to back up if you don't mind for a second.
Sorry.
There's a term there that we didn't spell out. I just want to make sure that we make note of it. In the choice column that we have HALT, which refers to a phrase actually that we learn in the 12-step program: hungry, angry, lonely, tired, HALT. And so similar to thinking about folks that learn this in the recovery process of your cylinders, 4-cylinder car, and are any of your cylinders depleted? And if you think about a 4-cylinder car, and if you're only operating on 2 cylinders, the car is probably not going to get you where it needs to get. So the cylinders stand for hungry, angry, lonely, tired. The other piece that I just want to, you know, for me, what I try to do, and I'm better at it at times than other times, even just if you can see the blue part of these are all action verbs. And so I have the choice, right? Get active, encourage, focus, balance, offer, ask, maintain, engage. All those blue purposely are actionable items that I have control over. Can I acknowledge and witness, etc. So the details come after it in many ways, but I really ask you to ask yourself, how actionable are you willing to be, and how actionable is your workforce? Thanks.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for pointing that out. Right. So yes, continued in terms of the action items, and I just keep coming back to the word intentional. right? In terms of how are we asking ourselves how we're being intentional about these things? How are we holding others accountable for being intentional about these things? Not just, well, we kind of do things this way, or, you know, I'll get to it, right? The time is now, right? People need the response now, right? So you have these slides so that you can take a look at some of these pieces. But again, the action items, folks find these to be useful. So I am mindful of time. We have 10 minutes left. So this image here, you know, just again, we like visuals and hopefully it's helpful. A lot of times people hear trauma-informed care or approaches and like, oh, one more thing that you're asking me to pay attention to or do, right? And so reiterating that this truly is, as you can see on the bottom of the slide here, this is about the way that we do the work that we already do. Right, certainly some of those things take time. However, at the essence of this is how is it that we, you know, provide our services in a way that anchors those 5 values and principles? How do we run our meetings together in ways that anchor those 5 values and principles? How is it that our expectations, consequences, the way that we supervise, the way that we lead and communicate, the way that we think about our, again, physical, virtual space, our interactions with whoever it is that's in front of us in a trauma-informed way? So we really see this as the overarching umbrella, which is what this image describes. Again, the intentionality around doing these things in a trauma-informed way is the response that we know absolutely can cause a shift and make a difference for all of us.
And so we do know that at the anchoring piece of all of this, and possibly you are quite familiar with this term and have even seen this clip before, you know, empathy is different than other pieces. And so reason we bring empathy into our presentation today is that truly to be trauma informed, being empathic does matter. So this is, as you can see, less than a 3-minute clip. It's available on YouTube. And again, a treat, we hope. If you've not seen it before, if you've seen it, I've seen it lots of times. I get something out of it every time. So Sam, if you wouldn't mind, yeah, let's hear what Brene Brown has to say on empathy versus sympathy.
So what is empathy and why is it very different than sympathy? Empathy fuels connection. Sympathy drives disconnection. Empathy, it's very interesting. Teresa Wiseman is a nursing scholar who studied professions, very diverse professions where empathy is relevant, and came up with 4 qualities of empathy. Perspective taking, the ability to take the perspective of another person or recognize their perspective as their truth. Staying out of judgment, not easy when you enjoy it as much as most of us do. Recognizing emotion in other people and then communicating that. Empathy is feeling with people. And to me, I always think of empathy as this kind of sacred space when someone's kind of in a deep hole and they shout out from the bottom and they say, I'm stuck, it's dark, I'm overwhelmed. And then we look and we say, hey, climb down. I know what it's like down here and you're not alone. Sympathy is, woo, it's bad, no, you want a sandwich? Empathy is a choice, and it's a vulnerable choice, because in order to connect with you, I have to connect with something in myself that knows that feeling. Rarely, if ever, does an empathic response begin with at least. And we do it all the time, because you know what? Someone just shared something with us that's incredibly painful, and we're trying to silver lining it. I don't think that's a verb, but I'm using it as one. We're trying to put the silver lining around it. So I had a miscarriage. Oh, at least you know you can get pregnant. I think my marriage is falling apart. At least have a marriage. John's getting kicked out of school. At least Sarah is an A student. But one of the things we do sometimes in the face of very difficult conversations is we try to make things better. If I share something with you that's very difficult, I'd rather you say, I don't even know what to say right now. I'm just so glad you told me. Because the truth is, rarely can a response make something better. What makes something better is connection.
And, part of what we ask is that, it's not implied in this clip, but, how empathic are you with yourself? I think there's been a need for most of us to take pause and be gentle enough with noticing how we are thinking and feeling, yet let alone, obviously, in our work with others. The next slide tells us, that when we acknowledge, witness, validate, and be present, it allows us to be empathic. Hurt is hurt, and every time we honor our own struggle and the struggle of others by responding with empathy, the healing that results affects us all. And where we're looking to end right now is, we have a scale that we're asking you, how well are you doing? And do you check in with yourself around this each day moment? And the thing about a scale is that I think all of us know this already, we're never constant, right? We're always moving. And so what would it take to just inch a little bit higher to get more towards what needs to happen? What might I need to do? So with that being said, Lisa Green, I know that there are just, 155-ish, I think. I've got two different, 156. Sam, the next slide. Any questions, thoughts, comments from anyone as we finish up our time here? Well, this was a lot for, obviously all these minutes that we've been together. I'm seeing that Lisa's putting up a thank you. And Lisa, did you want to talk about this? You can. I will keep quiet right this moment. It's obviously pretty straightforward in terms of I see you unmuted, so go for it.
Well, really, I just wanted to thank you both for, that was so insightful and had so much packed into it. I think I'll be unpacking that presentation for a few days. We did have a question. Mark asked, are different tactics used for young adults versus middle-aged adults?
When it comes to the piece around the universal precaution, certainly I think it matters who's in front of you, right? And so that would matter, right? In terms of what would create emotional safety for that person and or what would be a choice piece here. And so it's very individualized, yet at the same time, depending on, if you're working with groups of people, there's some generalities. It's a tough one to, without knowing specifically, Mark, what you are wondering. That's my best response right now. Sam, anything to add to that?
Just reiterating that the 5 values are constant. The way that's operationalized absolutely is individualized based on who's in front of you.
And also, thank you for the handouts, because that, having had them explained and looking at all those action words there, it's very empowering to know that there are things that we can be doing to make things better for ourselves and for the people that we work with and for. So thank you very much for that. If anyone needs me to resend that material out, I can do that. Is it all right if I share your slides with participants as well?
Yeah, I sent you the PDF version.
Okay, so I can do that. Please go and fill out an evaluation form on our website because we'd love to know what we can do better, and your comments about the presentation. Again, thank you so much to Susan and Samantha. It was wonderful. In case you're not looking at the chat, Lauren had another comment. Thank you so much for your assistance. This has been very informative and helpful. Lisa and Susan, I'm so sad to hear of your losses. I hope your happy memories help you find peace. And yes, that's absolutely true.
Thank you.
So thank you, Lauren.
Thank you. Yes.
Next week's session. Go ahead.
Be safe. Thank you everyone for, being present with us. It's, we're all moving through this together.
Absolutely. Next week's topic is legal issues associated with telehealth services. I'm so glad that Susan and Samantha brought up the self-care, because we do have another week's topic that is self-care for healthcare professionals, which will go even further into how you can care for yourselves during this really challenging and stressful time. So have a great day, everybody. Thank you to our presenters again, and we will see you next time.